Yeah, thank you everyone. So the sort of the second half hour of the aviation hour, I think like Sarah's talk, there's a few plane crashes and whatnot. It's the same sort of warning before we get into it. So today I'm going to look at sort of navigating planes in sort of a hostile radio environment. So for those who don't know me, I'm Dave Carrot. I do security stuff in Wellington, run CrikeyCon, do some other stuff. Like Sarah, also have stickers with me. So what are we going to look at today? We're going to look at how planes navigate, get around. We're going to look at some of the attacks on sort of the aviation navigation systems from a pilot's perspective and also an air traffic control, ATC's perspective, and what we can do about it. So up front, we'll just do a little bit of terminology. GNSS, that's the Global Navigation Satellite System. So if you think GPS, or which is the US one, you've got GLONASS, which is Russian, Baidu, which is China, Galileo, which is Europe. Those are the different sort of satellite systems that you can use for navigation. I will say GPS some of the time during this talk when I actually mean GNSS. Most of the time I am talking about the generic term of using satellites for navigation. So how do planes know where they are? So way back when, there was a few different technologies. The first one was dead reckoning. If I head in this direction at this speed for so many minutes, I'm going to be here on a map. And after that, we sort of had a little bit of radio, had some automatic direction finding, some VORs, some LORAN, some stuff like that. But we sort of moved away from that because things like dead reckoning didn't factor in wind and things like that, so you didn't always end up where you were meant to be. Sort of fine over land where you can look down and see what's around you, but not so good when you're over an ocean and you miss the island you're trying to land on. And some of these radio systems that have been really effective, they're really costly to run because you need this big transmitter, you need all this particular specialized technology, it needs to be calibrated regularly, it's really expensive to run, and so basically they're not putting in new ground-based radio systems and decommissioning stuff as it breaks because it's cheaper to decommission it than actually fix it, and it has the issue that it doesn't really work particularly well when you're over the ocean because having a fixed transmitter on the ocean is rather difficult. So what are we doing today? So most planes will navigate with satellite systems, predominantly GPS because that is what's older, has been certified for all the planes, and one of the big things about aviation, it's a slow-moving industry because of the safety stuff, and a lot of the stuff's only certified for GPS. There's another one which is inertial navigation system. This is sort of inside planes, they have a series of gyroscopes and they can detect their accelerations and yaw and pitch and roll and get their accelerations, the decelerations, they can figure out where they are. And there's also instrument landing systems, which is another radio system actually at airports to help planes land. So the initial navigation systems have some limitations. Depending on the age and the model, they'll actually drift by about half to 1 nautical mile per hour. So if you're doing sort of a 15-hour flight, you're going to be 15 miles off. So it will most probably get you to the country you're trying to get to, maybe not so much the runway. And you have to remember to reset the starting location each time correctly, because I think there was a case with, in New Zealand back in the day, they were flying down to Antarctica to do some sightseeing flights. They hadn't set the inertial navigation system correctly, and unfortunately that flew into Mount Erebus. And these inertial navigation systems, now that we've got GPS, you can reset the location based off GPS during the flight, but what happens if you don't actually trust the GPS location because someone is tampering with it? And just a quick little thing, this is how instrument landing systems work. At the end of the runway, they broadcast a glide slope, so that helps you get the up and the down, and a lateral one, so you can get online and you can fly that down and you'll land on the runway at the relevant place. So then, from the ground, how does air traffic control know where the planes are? There is the primary radar, so if you've ever seen a spinning radar dish on top of something, that's primary radar. It sends out a response, bounces off the plane, comes back, they know where things are. And additionally, there is multilateralation, or MLAT, and this uses multiple receivers and the time difference of getting the signal on arrival. You can do some complicated maths and you can figure out where you are. But this does need to be a digital signal, so there's a clear bit to actually do it on, and you sort of do this maths and stuff happens and you get a location out of it. I'm not entirely sure how the maths works, but people far smarter than me have figured it out. Planes will also broadcast their location. So ADS-B, if you've ever come across a site like Flight Radar or something and you can see all the planes flying around, this is sites collecting this ADS-B data, putting it on the net. So planes and also ground vehicles at airports will broadcast their locations based on the GPS or, in some cases, the inertial navigation systems. And when, depending on how good the GPS signal is or whether they're an INS, they also have in the data packet, they say how accurate they think their location is. So what could go wrong, right? GPS is absolutely fine. Well, Russia and some others have decided that, hey, jamming GPS and spoofing GPS is something they can do to affect the people who are their adversaries. So we see lots of articles about this, that lots of GPS things, planes are having to fly more on direct routes. Some airports they're no longer flying to, some of the sort of Scandinavian airlines. And how can we sort of get to fix this? And I think Flight Radar provides a map of where they think sort of GPS spoofing and GPS jamming is happening. And sort of on the red dots is where they see that sort of the low quality signal out of the ADS-B message, and the greens when they're sort of getting good stuff. So you'll see that there's stuff happening around sort of the Russia, the Ukraine, the Crimea, and also sort of down in Southeast Asia as well. So how can planes tell if there is some GPS shenanigans going on? They can sometimes detect a sudden jump in location, that if the location changes faster than they're flying, that's a sign that could be some. And also, one thing that a lot of people are seeing is because the GPS signal is basically just an atomic clock with a really accurate time, pilots are seeing, particularly up in the Scandinavians, I think I've seen some video of it, and they'll suddenly see their time jump by sort of 30 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes. And when that happens, they know that something's going on, and the systems are now actually starting to detect and alert the pilots that this is actually happening. So a little bit about terminology, spoofing versus jamming. Jamming is just putting out a lot of noise, interference on the relevant frequencies. The GPS signal sending satellites are about 20,000 kilometers away. The signal that you actually need to read to process the location is actually lower than the noise floor. So you've got all the noise, just background noise, and you're actually trying to pick out the signal in the background noise. So it's really easy to jam and interfere because it's not a particularly strong signal. Spoofing is a little bit more sophisticated, and that's actually sending out a valid GPS or GNSS signal, but it's actually for the wrong time or the wrong location. So I think back in the day I did a few talks on sort of that, if you want some more stuff about actual GPS spoofing and controlling time. Back in 2017 I did some talks on that. So what does this actually mean? Planes don't know where they are, so they're using less optimal routes, which might mean more fuel burn. I think some of the Scandinavian airlines have actually stopped flying to some airports and border regions, so communities aren't actually getting air services anymore. So what are some of the worst cases that if a plane does fly on course? Back in 1983, there was the Korean Airlines flight from Alaska through to South Korea. It was basically just running off the inertial navigation system. It got off course. It flew over Russian airspace in a particular sensitive sort of restricted airspace for Russia. Russia shot the plane down. There was political stuff around that, of course. But one of the outcomes out of this was GPS at the time was being developed just for the military. But when they saw this happen, the US realized that, hey, maybe we should make the GPS available to everyone. So hopefully we can stop this happening. And for the cost and the ease of use, there is code online that will do GPS spoofing and GPS jamming. I did it back in the day with sort of less than $500 worth of software-defined radio kits, some Raspberry Pis and some batteries. Or you could just buy a jammer offline if you don't want people to track where you are. So, the air traffic navigation systems, the air traffic control, they're trying to save money with some of this navigation stuff. So they're turning off the very high frequency on no range thing. So that's a ground-based transmitter that helps location. They're turning off primary radars. They're not installing new ones. They're not maintaining them. They're decommissioning them, not fixing them, because they're putting a lot more emphasis on all the planes having ADS-B. So the planes broadcasting their own location based on that GPS GNSS. To the point of, in New Zealand currently, we've only got 2 primary radars working. There's one in Auckland, one in Wellington, and one in Christchurch, and the one in Wellington's actually been down for some time for maintenance, and I'm not sure when that's actually coming back. So that's the actual radar coverage in New Zealand. So, you know, what are they doing? So air traffic control is predominantly getting it off ADS-B, so that's where the plane tells air traffic control where it is. Planes have to have ADS-B out if they go into the big airports in congested airspace or up above 28,000 feet. But what happens if the plane doesn't know where it is? There's still ways that air traffic control can know where the planes are. So there's the MLAT, that multilateral relation that I mentioned before. The coverage still isn't there, but the planes still need to be broadcasting a Mode S transponder. So Mode S was the sort of the generation of transponders before ADS-B. It basically just spits out the plane's a hex code, a serial number for the plane, and it just does that. And then from that, and with 3 or 4 stations, you can actually figure out the location of the plane based on that. But then that's costly to implement and run because all these base stations need a low latency link between them, so they can actually look at the time difference of arrival. And this is the coverage in New Zealand. It is just the bottom of the South Island, basically around Queenstown Airport. So the coverage isn't actually that great for that. So if these all have weaknesses, what are some other new up-and-coming technologies that have been simplified in recent years? So there's direction finding. Sort of previously with direction finding, you had to have a big antenna array, you had to have a directional antenna, and you had to sort of sweep it past and point it out, and you see when the signal got stronger, and that's the direction you head. Now there's systems like this Kraken SDR, which takes 5 radios and 5 antennas, and what that does is, based on how the signal comes in, is detected by the 5 different antennas, you can do some maths and you can start getting bearings out of that. So this is sort of the user interface. You can sort of see that high point on the left there, that's obviously the bearing to where the transmitter is, and there's also an Android app for it, so I actually start plotting it on the map of where it thinks the transmitter actually is. So basically you put the 5 antennas in a circle based on the frequency you're trying to get, and the different timing and phase of the signal antennas calculate the directions. And that it's sort of similar to MLAT, but it has the benefit. I will only give you a direction, not an actual location. But if you had multiple of them, you can get a cross reference. You draw the lines, and they'll meet up at one point ideally. And this has the benefit is the MLAT requires, because you're looking at the time, you need an additional signal that has sort of the ups and the downs for each bit. But this. The direction finding can actually track audio, ADS-B, ACARS, if you think text messaging, but for pilots. So it could actually use anything that has been transmitted by a plane. And this is less than $1,000 for some hobbyist kit. I mean, this is aviation, so that's actually going to be maybe $10,000 to $100,000 per site, because aviation, you add a 0 or 2 to any price tag. And plus all the back-end systems to correlate it and display it to sort of air traffic control. So, and planes could also use this. They could get fixes off TV and radio towers. If you know where the TV and radio towers are, you can then start drawing off if the TV tower's at that direction and the radio tower's at that direction, I must be here. So you can start cross-referencing some of this stuff. And this is the benefit that the TV company and the radio company is paying for their expensive transmitter and to keep it up. So that is a benefit, and people can't really. And then also you could also track where other planes are as well. These ground-based arrays, the high-powered. Someone's really going to notice if have a multi-kilowatt transmitter. They're going to be big. They're quite hard to hide. So you could, having a clandestine one is going to be rather difficult. And if they're jammed, and in New Zealand at least, the spectrum management people are very good at tracking down sort of rogue stuff that interferes with TV and radio, because people complain about that. Some of the cons for planes, you're going to need a set of radios per frequency monitored, because you need to set up that sort of the array in the correct thing for the optimal layout. It's only going to be useful over land and coastal areas, because you need some ground-based transmitters. So what can ATC use for it? They can direction find and cross-reference the ADSB, the Mode S messages. They could, when someone broadcasts an audio message, they could track that down to make sure that's where it's coming from. Though unfortunately audio isn't continuous, you only talk when it's spoken to. ADSB is 2 messages per second out of every plane, and you can triangulate them for multiple sites, and you don't need that low latency and timing that you did for MLAT. And additionally, there are people who think it's really funny to get on the air traffic control audio frequencies and do hoax messages. If you have all this set up, you'd actually track them down really quickly and get some people to deal to these hoaxes. What are some of the cons for ATC? It's only going to sort of work in the horizontal plane, because it's sort of at distance. Different altitudes aren't really going to be that apparent because of the way angles work and triangles. And you'd also need a second array sort of orientated for the vertical plane. And it's going to require more equipment at each site compared to MLAT. MLAT's only going to require 1 receiver. This has actually got to have 5 receivers, but you don't have to have a low latency link between them. And if you're tracking things like voice radio, there's sort of no ID in the messages, so you're only getting, you can't actually, you need another way to actually identify that plane at that location. So another cool technology that's coming up is passive radar. So we previously talked about the primary radars. These things spin around, send a message out, bounce it back. But what passive radar is, it uses the people who are already broadcasting radio as your signal. So if you've got FM stations, TV stations, cell-based stations, what you do is you have a radio that receives all those things and basically makes a baseline of what the radio looks like. And then and you need to know the fixed location of the receiver and the fixed location of the broadcaster. It's only going to be helpful for ATC. So you benchmark the spectrum. While planes fly through the air or other objects move through the air, they're going to reflect these radio waves. They're going to change the wavelength, change the polarization, and when you do some cool physics on all that stuff and some maths, you can get a location, a speed, and a direction out of it. In the simplest form, you think the police with a radar gun, actually when that bounces off the car and comes back to the radar gun, it's actually changed the wavelength of the signal slightly, and that's how they get the speed out of it. This is sort of on a whole nother scale and a whole nother range. And you do need 2 radios with this. You have one radio that's sort of listening to the background frequencies and one that's sort of looking for how things change, and you do need to wire these up. This is some hack RFs. Do you need to wire them up so they're actually using a common clock so everything is in sync. And you can see here, this is an image of sort of real-time stuff, and you can see a few little planes out there. That bright line in the middle, that's sort of the actual transmitter. But I think along the bottom you've got the angle, so you've got the distance, and up on the vertical axis you've sort of got the direction. And similarly, I think this is the same thing over time. You can see the transmitter in the middle, but where that red arrow's pointing, you can see that line's actually changing in regards to the x-axis, and that's the plane sort of actually moving through the air. So what are the pros for ADCs? You can get a location with just one receiver. You can get distance and direction. It needs less radios than direction finding, only 2 versus 5. TV and FM and cell companies are doing their expensive broadcast portion. You can tie multiple together on multiple frequencies for cross-referencing and getting a tighter location. Unfortunately, one of the big problems with passive radar is ITAR, so the International Traffic and Arms Regulations are things that mean that you can't send weapons overseas to particular people. That covers all this passive radar stuff. The Kraken SDR, which I mentioned earlier, they did have some passive radar code on GitHub. They were told to remove it, but there are other examples of people who have done passive radar up on GitHub that haven't been removed yet. And there are also some other things like what is old is new again. There was LORAN back in the day. There was an old decommissioned technology that was some real big, powerful transmitters based on land that sort of did locations. It was mainly for naval stuff. But then that sort of got to get decommissioned because it was expensive and there was GPS. But, you know, with the GPS jamming back in sort of 2017, 2018, they were sort of looking at, the US in particular, looking at, can we re-implement this ELORAN network? Because there was some jamming and spoofing in the Black Sea in North Korea. So what ELORAN works by, basically similar to GPS, it has a whole bunch of towers that are in sync, pushing out a time signal, and from the difference in time and phase, you can infer location. It gives you about a 10-meter accuracy. So some pros for planes, so it's going to be a much stronger signal than with GPS, so it's harder to drown out, spoof, or jam. 10 meters is sort of good enough for navigation, but not for landing. Some cons for planes is it's still only talk. Back in 2017 and 2018 in the US, some legislation passed that said the Coast Guard needed to actually implement this, but it's now 2025 and nothing has really happened about it. And it's only good for about 1,200 kilometres from the coast. But then again, most of the jamming's happening on coastal areas or over land. When you're out over ocean, GPS is generally fine. And what's a cool technology that I think some drones, particularly delivery drones, are going to use is starting the Earth fingerprinting. So they have cameras that look down at the Earth and basically make a fingerprint. And using the camera and using this big database of the fingerprints, they know where they are. I think previously some missiles used this as well, but now I think some drone manufacturers are starting to use it. So you'll see that bottom right, that's sort of the satellite view of what the land looks like, and then they've made this fingerprint, which is that sort of blue and grey model up above, and from that you can infer where you are. And, you know, it's hard to change large portions of terrain at scale. People notice when you start removing mountain ranges or building mountain ranges, a little bit hard to hide, and that can be beneficial. I think a lot of drones, particularly the delivery drones, are looking at this for their sort of navigational technology, because in sort of urban jungles, GPS doesn't work because you get a lot of reflection off buildings. So they're looking at ways of how to can navigate and can drop your Amazon Prime stuff on your front lawn. But some of the cons of planes, you need to see the ground. You need to actually be able to see the ground, and you need to be over land because the ocean, unfortunately, looks awfully the same for most of it. It doesn't really not much to fingerprint over the ocean. So sort of for wrapping up, using the same diagram that Sarah used before, there's no easy options. But what we've seen is we used to have a large range of ways to navigate, but now we've sort of reduced that down to sort of everything's GPS or instrument landing systems. So maybe, hey, we need to actually look at expanding it out so there's multiple ways to cross-reference. So we remove the sort of Swiss cheese model. And focusing on land and coastal areas is fine, but because there is less jamming over oceans. So what's next is really it's up to the aviation regulators, the airline manufacturers, the parts suppliers to start implementing this. Ideally, hopefully, we can get some traction on this before it's written in blood, but we'll have to see about that. So hopefully I've covered, you've got a little idea about sort of how planes navigate, some pilot set to air traffic control perspective, what we can do about it. So I'd like to say thank you to the crew for selecting my talk, running a great con. Thank you for coming and spending your Saturday here with us. You know, there's lots of great other talks. Thank you. Woo! Thank you.
So thanks for coming over, and again, I'm actually hopping on a plane on Tuesday, and after you and Sarah, I'm not sure I still should, but I'm sure it'll be fun, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks, dude.
Yeah,
and
cool.
thanks for coming all the way that you did.
No worries.
Both awesome and scary at the same time.